Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Daita Sergi, ASHI's Education Programs Manager, and I'll be the moderator today. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. As many of you know, ASHI's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We are an international association with about 1,000 members spread across more than 20 countries, including Belize and Greece. We serve as the professional home for campus sustainability staff, but we offer resources for everyone in higher education. We provide an expansive collection of online resources, networking tools, educational events such as today's webinar, and an annual conference and expo, which will be held in less than a month in Pittsburgh on October 2nd to the 5th. Registration closes this coming Monday on September 17th, so make sure to register now to join us at the conference. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You can do that by typing your questions or comments in the questions pane in the control panel on your screen. If you have additional questions, please email them to education@ashi.org and we will get back to you. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback regarding today's presentation. We take your suggestions into account when planning for future webinars, so please do provide this feedback. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later. The recording and presentation materials will all be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Tina Woolston will be the moderator today. She oversees Tufts University's sustainability planning, reporting, and programming. She also teaches a course in the Environmental Studies Department and Tufts called Sustainability in Action, which focuses on introducing students to the myriad of career paths that involve sustainability. At this time, I will turn things over to Tina.
Thank you, Daita, and thank you to ASHI for allowing us to present on this interesting topic. At Tufts, we estimate that air travel from study abroad and staff and faculty travel is responsible for about 12% of our greenhouse gas emissions, although it's notoriously difficult to calculate. And estimates of emissions from air travel at institutions of higher ed can range wildly depending on what data is available. In fact, aviation can be responsible for a large proportion of the climate impact of professional life in university communities, with tenure-track faculty being expected to present at conferences all over the world. One much discussed option for reducing this climate impact is to shift some conferencing activities to online distance formats. However, university professionals recognize limits and in some cases actively dislike current webinar formats, in part because they lack the personal warmth of conventional conferences. I am pleased today to be able to welcome our speakers who have all developed alternatives to the simple sit at the desk and listen model. First, we're going to hear from Ken Hiltner, Professor of English and Environmental Studies Departments at UC Santa Barbara, who will describe the asynchronous conference he is involved with that takes place over several weeks and uses pre-recorded presentations and text-based questions and answers. Next, Melissa Tier, the Sustainability Program Manager in the Office of Sustainability at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, will outline a partially virtual symposium which took an existing local annual event and expanded its reach by having one main location and 2 satellite locations where participants could gather without having to travel very far. And lastly, we will hear from Richard Parncut, Professor of Systemic Musicology at the University of Graz in Austria, who managed a conference that happened in 4 locations simultaneously on 4 different continents and included real-time, 2-way live discussions. I know you're going to learn a lot and hopefully be inspired to try your own virtual event. And now I'd like to welcome Professor Ken Hiltner, who will talk about the virtual conference, Climate Change, Views from the Humanities.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Hopefully you all can see my screen now. So I should note by saying that at UC Santa Barbara, we've calculated our the campus carbon footprint, and we found out that air travel, staff and faculty, is combined about 30% of the campus, even as much as a third, depending on how you do the calculation, a third of the campus carbon footprint. That translates into about 55 million pounds of CO2 or equivalent gases every year. And part of the reason I think it's higher at UC Santa Barbara Barbara than Tufts is because we've had a sustained carbon neutrality initiative going on for a few years now. We hope to be, in many ways, carbon neutral by 2025. But the more we do, the more solar panels we put in and all, and we shift other things to renewable, transportation just keeps growing as a portion of it all along. So I'm going to show you an option that we've developed here. We've now conducted 6 events of this sort. I'm going to show you 2 of them. And I think probably the easiest thing to do is to show you first what it's like. And there were 2 conferences. I'm shifting to our first one now. And you're looking at the conference website, and it's a pretty traditional website. If you scroll down, you have the description of the event, what's going on, nice pictures. We try to make everything as attractive as possible. Opening talk, keynote talks, we go into the actual panels here. And in this case, we had 14 panels, and if you wanted to find out about an individual speaker, you can just click on their name. It tells you about who they are and what the conference talk is going to be like and all. So at this point, it may look just like sort of a schedule for a conference. You see a lot of conference web pages like this. What's different, however, this is the actual conference itself. Conference is not a real-time conference like the one that we're attending now, but the talks are pre-recorded, and the Q&A sessions also take place online in text form over a 3-week period. Again, probably easier just to show you. So let's click on one of the panels here. Here's a panel. You have 3 speakers. The talks are pre-recorded. For this first conference, we used Vimeo as a streaming source. Now we use YouTube, and I'll explain why in a minute. One of the advantages of this approach is by pre-recording the talk, we get a much better quality actual video during the event. And the reason for that is, streaming sources like Vimeo and YouTube and also like Netflix, they're able to build a little buffer in with the video so that if your internet connection, sort of lapses for a second or 2, it doesn't matter because they already have like, 30-second buffer to go by. And the quality tends to be higher. So I'll just show you the beginning of what one talk looks like.
So my name is Chris Robertson, and I'm going to talk about what is a cultural intervention. And this is a deep question.
So this is one type of presentation, kind of what you're getting from me right now, which is just the person speaking. There are alternative ways of recording a talk. So let's see if I can't go to another conference here, another panel here, and I'll show you. In fact, I'll see if I can't pop this up into full screen mode.
My name is John Ryan from the University of Western Australia. This paper is an initial attempt to think through how some of the ideas catalyzed.
So in this case, what's going to happen is the speaker is not on screen at all. It's entirely going to be a PowerPoint presentation. It's possible to do a talk that's a combination of those two. So, you go back and forth between the actual speaker and their PowerPoint or Prezi, or there's a little window with the person in it. But also note, and this was actually a surprise when we got it for this first panel, that there are other ways of doing it. And this talk that I'm going to show you, they actually did the talk as a little mini documentary. It was about sort of conservation along this Illawarra region, water region of Australia, and they showed what they were doing while they were doing the talks. Let me just give you a minute or so of that one too. You're going to see. This is the region. In a minute, they're going to start the talk, but it's a really well done presentation, I thought.
We are members of a group called Waterways of the Illawarra. We live in the Illawarra region just south of Sydney. For the last couple of years, we've been walking our local waterways. We start at the sea and head inland as far as we can go. We position it as a socially engaged art project, but it's also simply a way of creating a deeper connection to the local area where we live.
There's an enormous amount of potential on how different presentations can be done here. So the way the conference is set up is when the conference goes live, when we open it, all the videos are then loaded up there. So you can stream those at any time over a 3-week period. So you don't have to worry about like this one actually showing up at the exact moment of the panel. You have 3 weeks to do it. You can watch as much or as little as you want. Then during that period, I'll show you another panel here. This is one I did, and I'll tell you why in a moment. This is where we switched first to YouTube as a streaming source. And one of the reasons that we did that was YouTube creates closed captioning for all of its videos. It's notoriously inaccurate, I know that, but YouTube also makes it relatively simple as long as you're familiar with the process. And we actually created a little video to explain it to participants, how to go about doing it. And what happens is you can edit that YouTube file that creates closed captioning for accuracy. If you think about it, what you've done then is you've created an actual transcript of the talk. So let me just pop my talk here going up for a minute, and you can see the closed captioning and how it works. So during this November 2016 conference, which takes as its theme the world in 2050, something altogether extraordinary, almost unthinkable happened, and that is that the world in 2050 changed. This was my little talk about it. It was the day after the presidential election. But what's interesting about that is we can also grab that transcript, and if you look to the side here, it might be hard for you to see, but this is the actual talk in its entirety right next to the video, and it's actually time-stamped. So if you want to just go in and scroll ahead and find something of interest to you, you can do that. It's also very important that we put it here on the web page because it's now available to Google and other search engine crawlers, so that they can go in and find it. And if there's a particular thing you're talking about in the talk, it's actually there as text that is referenced by search engines. It's also very important for us to make these events completely accessible as much as possible. So if someone has difficulty hearing, you have this there, with the transcript. Also, if someone actually has difficulty visually, we also use as many on-screen features as we can for text readers to make it accessible. So that's the presentation end of it. But I mentioned it's open for 3 weeks, and the reason for that is if we scroll down here a little further, you can see this is an online Q&A session. So the conference opens, people start watching videos. After the video, you have the option of coming down below and posting comments, questions. This is where the Q&A takes place. It is not a verbal Q&A, it is a written Q&A. The advantages of doing it over a number of weeks is it completely eradicates a problem with time zones. So, you can be at the other part of the world from someone, and maybe even for this conference, you're waking up earlier or something. I know I'm 3 hours different from Tufts, but if I were on another part of the world, I could be 11 or 12 hours difference. It doesn't matter here, though. You wake up in the morning, you see someone has posted a comment to your talk. In fact, the software, and we've customized it to work here. It's actually running out of WordPress, but we made our own sort of intervention in it. Will actually tell you. So I am the person who presented here. I will actually find every time someone sends a question or makes a comment to my panel, it actually gets sent in its entirety to my phone in the form of an email, so I can see if there's something there. And then when I wake up, I can comment. And I think it's interesting. The first person who commented here was actually from Buenos Aires. So we also think this is really important. Aside from important environmentally, it opens up the world in a way that never happened before. Most conferences taking place in whether North America or the EU or other places, we haven't really thought about it much, but most of the world was summarily excluded from these conferences. Someone in Buenos Aires to fly to Santa Barbara, California, it can be very expensive. For many parts of the developing world, that ticket can be more than the per capita income in those places. And this makes it sort of much more democratic, that anyone can participate. All you need is some sort sort of connected device. It doesn't even have to be a computer. Mobile devices work just fine for this. And in fact, we've had any number of talks that were actually filmed with a smartphone. Smartphone now have high definition videos rivaling, the definition of broadcasting now. So it opens things up in a world in a way they were never opened up before. The other thing, and we were kind of surprised about this, the level of conversation that happens in the Q&A is both longer and of greater depth, I would argue. So if we look down at this conversation that happened around my talk, it keeps going and going and going and going. In fact, there are 16,000 words of discussion that emerged out of this talk. That's an enormous amount. In fact, this conference, both of these conferences, generated over 75,000 words of Q&A discussion. That's a book in itself. That's very different than a 15-minute Q&A session. And furthermore, being a professor of literature, I can tell you that there's a far greater precision to written language than spoken often. That's why when you read like a novel and the dialogue is just so good and the words are so carefully chosen, because it didn't happen in real time. Someone labored over that and thought about it. Maybe here we're not laboring quite as much over these comments, but it's more than just what is written in one moment. And so that also allows, because of this, a protracted back and forth discussion between individuals that you just can't have, otherwise. People often are concerned that if you have, virtual events like this, and I think conference we coordinated, that you have a loss of personal human contact. But if you look at the statistics for something like YouTube, over half the people talking on YouTube are communicating with people that are less than 25 miles from where they live. And the reason is, especially a new generation has grown up with social networking and all. They're used to online interaction, and we're trying to leverage that here in a way this does work, like online, social networking. And I should note a few other things, and that is that it is simpler for anyone to stage a conference like this now. If you're familiar right now, this is all kind of hacked out of WordPress, and I've actually written a white paper / practical guide telling people how to do it. If you're familiar with like blogging in WordPress, you can have a conference website set up in a day. Hopefully, if this actually catches on, someone will step up and make a commercial product like GoToWebinar that would actually do it and make it even easier. But right now it's not very difficult, but it's far easier than actually mounting a full conference, because conference can take an enormous amount of preparation, and as far as carbon footprint, it's not just flying. It's you have to have an actual site, a venue where it's happening. There are meals, there's ground transportation to and from the airport, both for people arriving and for people leaving again. It's an enormous issue, and on that, I should note that we've done some back of the napkin calculations for the savings that an event like this can have over a traditional fly-in conference. So we did that because, for each of these people that you see here, each panelist, we knew exactly where they lived, and we were able to calculate the flight that they would have had to make to Los Angeles, which is our closest nearby international airport, and then the little flight to Santa Barbara. And we added up all those miles. We were able to calculate the carbon footprint of all that. And then we also calculated the carbon footprint of the online activity here. And online activity, especially sending out video, streaming video, is not insignificant. So we were able to figure that out. And even though it's high compared to text-based internet activity, it's a fraction of what the event would have been if if people had flown in. It's in fact less than 1%. And I should note that that number, at least here at UC Santa Barbara, will drop more and more. And that's because already in California, 30% of the electricity in the state comes from renewables. And as that keeps increasing, those renewables can supply the electricity that's needed for an online event. There's no way you can use ground-based electricity to fly an airplane. People talk about electric airplanes, but they're far in the future. So this, is a usable system right now. The other thing, it's easier to get participants to come, and it's wonderful in that, one conference, I think it was the World in 2050, we had participants from all 6 continents, no one from Antarctica. It's also easier to get keynote speakers involved too, because they don't have to make the commitment of many days and all. And ultimately, it's different, but it's an interesting way to take part in a conference because it's over a 3-week period, you don't have to make that same kind of time commitment there. You block off 2 or 3 or 7 days for a conference. You can do it, an hour here and an hour there, and it's ultimately more convenient in that sense. So, will this become the conference of the future? I'm not sure, but it is something to think about for academia, especially because the technology exists now, the infrastructure exists now, even in the developing world, as long as the university provides access to the internet, and it can even be a 10-year-old computer. This is not requiring, virtual reality and 3D avatars or anything. It means that we can connect the world without worrying about time zones right now. And then what gets left behind is a complete archive of the talk. So, many conferences will have conference proceedings printed up and written afterwards, but here it is, the talks are all there. If we put the transcripts on, they're all there, and this enormous Q&A is all there too. So we think it's a model worth experimenting with, and if you have questions or suggestions, I'd be glad to hear them. So I think it's going back to you now, Tina.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. That was quite an innovative approach to conferencing. Next, we will hear from Melissa Tier at Swarthmore College, who will be discussing the Student Sustainability Leaders Symposium that she organized last year. Melissa?
Hello, just getting my screen up. Let's see. Doesn't look like the right screen.
We can see your screen. Just start your
Yeah, it looks
slides.
like you're seeing the wrong screen. I'm trying to change it to the other one. Is there a way for me to do that?
Yeah, go under sharing.
Got it. Okay. We'll get it. Let's see. There we go. Fantastic. Well, hi, everyone. As Tina said, I'm the Sustainability Manager at Swarthmore College, and I organized, was the lead organizer for the 2017 Student Sustainability Leaders Symposium, which is an annual event that happens in the Northeast of America. It happens at a different campus each year, and this was the first year that we did a semi-virtual conference. And I want to walk you through the context of how we set that up, in case anyone is interested in doing something similar, very different from the model that Ken was presenting just before. So as I mentioned, this is an event that occurs every year. In the past few years, it's occurred primarily at universities that are in the Boston area. And so when we applied, when Swarthmore applied and were offered to host the 2017 conference, we became the farthest south university to host this conference. And that was really what got us thinking about how do we get our attendees at the conference when this has typically been a Boston area event, but also how do we reduce the carbon emissions and not have so many students come down quite a ways to the mid-Atlantic and instead have an alternative option. So the goal of the event is to bring together student leaders from many different universities in the Northeast to learn and be inspired from each other at a half-day conference. This conference originated as something called the EcoRep Symposium, and it's worth just taking a moment to explain what an EcoRep program is for those of you who may not be familiar with them. So these are really common student programs at higher ed universities, typically that have a sustainability office like ours does. And then there are programs that work to promote environmental behavior, whether it's in the residence halls or through a waste program or other similar activities. And it's really a great opportunity for these parallel programs and students in those programs to have opportunity to meet and to share their success and share what they've been learning. Swarthmore has an EcoReps program. It's called the Green Advisor. It's about 10 years old, though it's taken a lot of different forms. And our Green Advisors, just as an example, they have a couple of different roles within the Office of Sustainability. They work in the residence halls as peer leaders. They manage our campus-wide compost system, and they partner with our staff EcoReps programs to work on sustainability initiatives in academic departments and staff offices throughout the college. That should give you an overview of the kind of students who are coming to this event every year. So in 2017, as I mentioned, we were interested in going virtual, seeing how we could do this differently, knowing that the conference was shifting southward to Philadelphia. And what we came up with was for all of our attendees to attend in person. So no one could log in online to this event. They had to go somewhere. But for there to be regional hubs so that no one would have to go very far, at most maybe 2 hours away for this half-day symposium. So we had 3 locations. Swarthmore in the Philadelphia region, Champlain College in Burlington, and it's right next to the University of Vermont, so there was a partnership there, and then Emerson College in the Boston area, so we maintained that location. You can see on the right, I believe that's at Emerson College, the picture where they're seeing the introduction of the event. And I think this is a cool shot. You'll see, if you can make it out, I'm presenting, and then there's a student panel behind me. And we'll see a picture of that panel later on. So you kind of get the view from the students who are in Boston listening to a panel, watching a panel, and then you'll see it later on from on-site at Swarthmore. So at the event, we had, just like kind of a common academic conference, we had sessions that occurred throughout the day. So we had 3 sessions, and then during each time slot, each session's time slot, there were 3 different options, one for each of our topic tracks. And you can see the tracks on the slide. And these are common themes that come up for students who are in EcoReps programs, who are interested in sustainability on campuses. If you're looking to do a student event, this might be a good resource for you, for the types of topics that students are typically interested in. So some context for how we went about setting up this conference. So I named the 4 universities who were involved, and we had 1 or 2 staff members at each of those locations who were the point people for their campuses. And they were tasked with scheduling locations, getting attendees to their location, setting up food. We had networking sessions on site at each of our regional hubs, and so the staff member was tasked with doing that for their location. Each of our campuses also had an EcoReps program, so there certainly were student staff involved in organizing this, and it was intended to be a student-attended and largely student-led conference. And then among our different campuses, we had varied levels of tech support. And that's I think, important to note. Here at Swarthmore, we had very, very minimal tech support. We have a small tech IT department. And since our conference was on a Sunday, our IT department does not support events on the weekends. And so we did not have additional staff during the event itself. Also worth mentioning, we were able to do this with pretty minimal budgeting. There was some money for the food that was offered at each of the events, each of the campuses, and that largely came from the cost of the event. There was, I think, a $15 to $20 registration cost. But really there was no other fundraising done for this event. And partially that's because at Swarthmore, at least, we're not able to fundraise in that way, sort of separately from our actual fundraising department. And that may be the case for you at another campus. There was also another event happening that weekend. So as I mentioned, our conference was on a Sunday. There was a major student conference happening the day before on that Saturday that was also in the Philadelphia region. And that had positives and negatives. especially when we were planning and thinking about what the effects might be of that planned conference post-landfill action network. One was there might be students coming down to the Philadelphia region already, and that was exciting since the SSLS event had typically been in Boston. We may be seeing more students already coming down to us. On the other hand, students have limited time. They want to go back to their campus. They want to do their homework, go back home. And so we weren't sure whether it would be a conflict to try to get students to come to both conferences. And so we really made an effort to partner with this organization so that we were advertising our events together. And that's something I think is a great tip, is just to know what regional events that might be related to yours are happening, and see if you can help each other out by advertising together. And then finally, at Swarthmore, and since we were the lead campus, we use Zoom, which is a different video conferencing technology than the one we're on today. And that's the one that our IT department supports, and so we had to go with Zoom. And something to just keep in mind is that the technology that might be available to your campus can be limiting or helpful in different ways. Okay, so here's an image of our the agenda for the day, the handout that we gave to all student attendees. It's complicated, and what we were trying to do is put into one page all the different things that were happening and what it would look like at each campus, so that there weren't different agendas for the different campuses. So I don't need to go through all this, but just wanted to show that, you know, it was complicated, and we tried our best to walk the students through what this schedule meant, especially because it's new, and I think they got it. I do. Okay, so here on the bottom right, you can see that panel that I talked about at the beginning. This is in the room now at Swarthmore for this introductory panel. So a real different experience being there in person, for sure. So some successes. We know that we feel confident that we got more people to come to the event on the whole. It was a little over 100 students in total, because we had these different options. So we got students who were from Maine attending in Vermont, who would not have come down to Swarthmore, and it's good that they didn't. It seems likely that we reduced our emissions in that way. One thing that I thought worked really well was, even though the sessions were, the presentations were heard by everyone through Zoom conferencing, discussions happened at each regional site. So students at every campus may have heard a presentation that occurred at Emerson in a session that they were attending, whether they were sitting at Swarthmore, Champlain, or Emerson. But then the Swarthmore students, or the students who were at Swarthmore, had a post-presentation discussion separate from the Emerson students and so on. And I think that worked really well. And then finally, and this doesn't really have to do with virtual conferencing, but the fact that we were trying to think innovatively about what a modern conference looks like led us to our introductory panel on diversity and inclusion in higher ed sustainability. The students came up with this panel. It was really, really fantastic, really excited the audience. We were able to talk of lots of different types of inclusion, and that is a key topic when we're talking about new technology and how to make sure everyone is able to access that technology if we are having a virtual webinar. Of course, the panel touched on other subjects related to diversity and inclusion as well, but I just wanted to bring that up. Some improvables, lessons we learned from this event. One is that technical difficulties definitely arose day of that we had not prepared for. We had done some practicing beforehand. I definitely would recommend doing even more practicing. But things showed up that we weren't expecting that sent us scrambling, and that's going to happen with a live virtual conference. It certainly is helpful if you can have IT support on deck, but know what you're getting into, know how to have resources on hand, because there will be surprises. We put the keynote at the end of the day, and I just wanted to mention that for any conference, particularly for a virtual webinar, this was hard because it was easy for students to leave this one in particular, and I wish we had the keynote earlier while we still had people, definitely planning to be there for longer, and so had higher attendance. We had difficulty tracking travel emissions, and for any virtual webinar, this will be key going forward. I think that a lot of this came from the fact that we had on-site registration, and this is going to be a difficulty with any student conference. It's hard to get students to register beforehand, especially if they are local. We did allow the on-site registration because we wanted to up our numbers, but it meant that we didn't exactly know where they were coming from as compared to the students who had registered several weeks in advance. Some key takeaways, this is just what I'll wrap up with, what I think the best recommendations are for anyone who wants to do a conference like this. The first is to clarify who your key stakeholders are for planning, whether you have a committee or point people at different locations. Together decide on what your reporting structure will be. Is there going to be one person who's really taking the lead and the rest are just committee members? Is the whole thing, every decision, going to be consensus based? It's important to set the ground rules for that. And then also to have a timeline that you're all following, especially if there are tasks that each location needs to complete. Second, identify that video conferencing technology early on. And what I recommend is to find one that shows both the audience, both the presenter and the slides at the same time. I think you're seeing that now on GoToMeeting. You're seeing both me talking and my slides. Zoom, the way that we were using it, it did not do that. It did not do that automatically. And each session needed to set that up on the computer that they were using in their room. And that certainly was inconvenient and ended up not happening every time if the person who was in the room didn't set it up correctly. So think about the technology that you're using and play around with it. Third, as I mentioned, schedule a keynote at a time where you know you'll have a captive audience. So earlier in the day, midday, during lunch, something like that, I think would be more effective. Number 4, assign a point person to every room where there's a talk being given. So it doesn't have to be a tech support person, just someone who you know is going to be in the room who is not the presenter. So they can make a call, they can send a text, or reach out to IT while the presentation can continue if there are any issues. And finally, and most importantly, do host a full dress rehearsal for any virtual webinar that's going to be live. Preferably with the actual presenters would be great, but at the very least to test out the technology in every location where it's going to be live. So if you do have multiple sessions that have different cameras going, whether it's at the same time or at different times throughout the conference, definitely try those out and try to mirror the setting as closely as possible that will occur the day of the conference. And for example, our conference was on a weekend. I think it's really important if you're going to have an event on the weekend to test it out, not on a weekday, and things like that. So that's the SSLS Virtual Conference of 2017 in a nutshell. I think my last comment is just that all of this is really new. As we've seen already from Ken and my presentation, we're trying out lots of new things. And the technology is just starting up, in my opinion. We know that video conferencing technology has grown a lot in recent years, but it's not yet been created for conferences. We have webinars like this, and I think we're at a pretty good point with that. We know we can make video calls, but I'd love to see the technology develop specifically for conferences where you can have interaction among attendees. And I think the more that we all try this, the likelier it is that technology will develop as we identify what the needs are. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Melissa. This is Tina again. I was part of that conference that Melissa was at, and I wanted to mention just one other thing that worked really well is we knew this is new technology and we were concerned about the IT, and so we had the presenters, at least for the opening session, come up with a list of discussion questions that we could use in case the IT stopped working. In that room that you showed in the beginning of everyone sitting looking at a screen, I was in that room at Emerson and we had real trouble with the sound, and so we ended up sort of turning off the session and having roundtable discussions just amongst ourselves. And so it was really great that we had prepared for that. And I'm really interested to hear what our next speaker has to say. Professor Richard Parncutt is going to talk about a really large, simultaneous virtual conference that called the International Conference on Music, Perception, and Cognition. And I think we had a satellite location in Boston, didn't we? I might have participated in that, but because it looks, I wonder if he solved some of the technical difficulties that we experienced at Swarthmore. So over to you.
Okay, can you see and hear me now?
Yep.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, hi everybody. It's great to be on this show. Thanks for the invitation. I especially enjoyed the talk by Ken and Melissa. I found myself agreeing with many things. So I'm going to talk today about a conference which was held in 4 global locations a month ago: Montreal, La Plata, Graz, and Sydney. And I'm going to tell you about how we managed to solve some of the problems that have been mentioned before. So first, I just would like to repeat some of the issues about flying that we've talked about. Why is it so important to avoid flying? I think it's interesting to do a quick calculation. If you fly intercontinental from Europe to Australia and back, for example, you would burn a ton of carbon, which would be equivalent to driving an ordinary way in a car for a year. And so that's a lot of carbon. And I think the point is that people's personal carbon footprints are affected a lot by flying to conferences. If you look at the total amount of contribution of aviation to global warming, it doesn't seem very much, but this small amount is created by a relatively small number of people, and each one of these persons can make a big effect by either flying or not flying to a conference. So I should just say I can't see myself, but I presume you can see me, is it right?
Yes, we see you.
That's funny, isn't it? I don't know what's going on here, but anyway. Oh, there I am. Okay, good. So, I'm interested in ways in which individuals could reduce their contribution to global warming. And there was an interesting paper by Wines and Nicholas, which I've just cited here, in which the authors did a lot of calculations and found out that if an individual in a rich country wants to reduce their contribution to global warming, they could have less children, they could not drive a car, they could avoid flying, or they could stop eating meat. And these are the main ways that one could do it. Another possibility is that one belongs to a group of people who are collectively having a carbon footprint, and this is the case when you're an academic going to a conference. So one strategy is to find out how that group of people can avoid making such a big carbon footprint. And another one, which I've marked here in red, is that we can use social media to spread the word in order to increase the information flow, and having a conference is also a way of doing it. We talked about different ways of avoiding carbon footprints in conferences already today, and I've just put a small illustration of this here. What I'm trying to do is find a compromise between 2 extremes, and you might regard the conventional conference format as one kind of extreme, the one on the right of the table, where you have high degree of face-to-face contact. People can fly all over the world to one location. You have a low degree of cultural diversity because many people in many countries can't afford to come to the conference, so there tends to be an emphasis on people from rich countries. You have a high amount of emissions per person, and the cost of participation is high when you consider the combination of flying, registration, and hotels in a rich country. So the other extreme is what Ken talked about in his presentation, where you have a completely virtual conference. There's low or zero face-to-face contact. Well, it's not really zero because the virtual communication possibilities are replacing it. There's a high degree of cultural diversity because anyone in the world can participate for almost the same low price. The emissions are low, close to zero, and the participation is cheap. So I wrote down in this table the things that we actually want are in red. And maybe we could strike a compromise between those 2 extremes, which I call the semi-virtual conference, a bit like what Melissa Tier just described. So the conference I'm thinking about has face-to-face contact at a medium level, but you can't talk to everybody personally. there's more cultural diversity, the greater the number of hubs that are included. The emissions are reduced, and I'm thinking of ways of making them even lower. And the cost of participation is also reduced, especially for people from developing or low-income countries. Another interesting issue is who should decide what kind of conference we have. And normally we think in an academic society that we should satisfy the interests of our members. And these are the people who are normally living in high-income countries, and they're doing the research. And there are other people who are benefiting from our research, and those people are also usually in high-income countries. It's an interesting question whether we should also consider people from medium-income countries who could become academics in the future if the cost of participation was reduced. And so I think it's a discussion which should be had. Should we try to take into account the views of those people, even if they can't participate in the discussion because they haven't actually managed to get their PhD yet because of financial limitations? And of course, we should also consider the children in developing countries who are likely to suffer the most as a result of climate change. And that's another interesting question. Should we take that into account when making our decisions? I'm having a bit of trouble going to the next slide. So I'll introduce now the society to which I belong that organised the conference recently. This is called the ICMPC, the International Conference on Music Perception and Cognition. It's not a society, it's a series of conferences that have been happening every 2 years for many years in different parts of the world. And this conference was combined with a European conference, of which I was the president of the committee, the European Society for the Cognitive Sciences of Music. And so we try to have this conference together every 6 years. And I became president of this society, and I was confronted with the possibility of reducing emissions by a different format of conference. And here's the way we finally decided to do it. We spread the conference across 4 different hubs, which, as we called them, in 4 different continents. And these 4 locations communicated simultaneously for 5 days throughout the conference. I could summarize here quickly the change that happened to the conference aims. I guess the conference aims before were obvious and people didn't really talk about them. The obvious aims were that we want to promote high quality research and collaboration in our academic discipline, which we called music cognition, but it could be any academic discipline. And we also aimed to promote academic exchange between people in different places by giving talks and posters, talking to each other personally. We wanted people to have fun and enjoy meeting each other because that inspires people to be creative and to do good research. And we also wanted to document the findings in abstracts and proceedings. And this is what happens in normal conferences and has always been happening for a long time. In addition to these aims, our new conference aimed to avoid doing harm to human beings. This is the basic point that you will find in research ethics documents in different disciplines. The ones that I'm familiar with are from the discipline of psychology, and I thought of the idea of applying this to the conference format. We wanted, in addition, to have more equal global distribution of our conference so that people from different continents could participate. We wanted the inclusion in the program to depend more on academic quality and less on the amount of money you have or the location where you live. We would like to have more cultural diversity, people from different cultures participating. We would like to have new forms of dissemination, so not only the proceedings, but also live streams. And of course, we wanted to reduce the emissions. I'm moving things around on my screen, excuse me. So an interesting issue is equity. How do we treat different people equally in a conference? And as Ken was already mentioning, at the moment we implicitly don't treat people equally because you have to have a lot of money to go to a normal international conference. And so to make that situation more equal, we would like to have a conference which is spread over different hubs, and each hub would have about the same number of participants. Then the hubs would be about equal in size. And it would also be good if one hub organized everything, but also was treated equally with the other hubs. So this is what we tried to do. We organized everything from one of the hubs, which was in Graz, but each hub had equal status in terms of transmitting to and from other hubs. every presentation in the conference was chosen on the basis of reviewers' ratings in normal peer review procedure, and everybody's talk appeared in two ways. One way was live, a regular conference presentation at their own hub, and the other way was a virtual talk at another location with a completely different audience, and the virtual talks were either at the same time as the original, in other words, real time, or they were delayed by a few hours because of time differences. So each hub on those 4 different locations had separate rooms for live talks and virtual talks, and they had different technology in the rooms. The live talks comprised a normal talk followed by a discussion session, question and answer session, and for those 2 parts of the live talk we used different software, which I'll talk about in a minute. The virtual talks, which were people in a different hub watching a video, had acoustic question and answers if the video was happening at the same time as the talk in the other location, or they had written questions and answers if there was a delay between the real-time talk and the delayed talk. The technology, we used 2 different kinds of technology, one for the talks themselves and one for the discussion. So for the talks themselves, we had one-way communication using YouTube. We found out after experimenting that YouTube had the best quality and was most convenient to use. And we used unlisted streams, which means that people searching in Google could not find those talks. So they were available only to registered members of the conference. We mixed the talking head with the PowerPoint screen using a software called OBS. So in general, there was a PowerPoint screen on the left and a talking head on the right. And we also had to mix the voice and the sound files. So in every hub, we need to have the technology to mix the images and to mix the sound. And all of these talks were live streamed so that every conference participant in every location was able to watch them on their mobile phone or on their laptop. And in addition, the links were available to all registered participants later after the conference. So this opened up new possibilities for communication. During the question and answer sessions, we used Zoom, as Melissa said she was using Zoom because we found it was high quality and most convenient for transmitting questions in 2 directions. So the remote audiences could see each other. In each room we had wireless microphones. And we also offered the opportunity of writing written comments in 2 different ways. One is the YouTube written comments and one is Moodle, which had a space for those comments. So there was a combination of different ways of discussion, and we found that was the best way to go. Everyone in the conference had a password which enabled them to access the links to these talks. And so we decided to go down the path where we try to protect all the information. Another possibility would be to open everything up to the whole world. If participants in the conference were agreeing to that, then every talk would be instantly transmitted to the internet. But this is not what we decided to do. Here is a picture of the 24-hour program for one day of the conference, just to show you how we dealt with the time differences. So in general, we had conference in the morning for communicating towards the east, and then there was a break in the middle of the day, followed by communicating towards the west in the evening. And I can show you how this works in Montreal, to take an example. Montreal in Canada, the conference went from 9 o'clock in the morning to 1 p.m. This is the 4-hour block here, which corresponds to UTC or GMT 13 to 17. And at the same time, the people in Argentina had almost the same time. In Graz, we were several hours later. So we had our late afternoon session coinciding with their morning session. So you can see this is the way we set up the whole conference, with the Sydney people being quite different from everyone else. We had a problem in Sydney that sometimes were not coinciding with any activity at other hubs, but in that time we did activities which were actually intended to be local only. The timing was controlled by a web page which everybody had at every hub because they just needed a computer connected to the internet, and the time said, the web page said what time it was in every hub, and it played music at the end of each talk to make sure people kept on time. We had 4 keynotes, one for each hub, and there was one on each day, and we made sure that each keynote was plenary so that everything else at all hubs stopped so that everybody could watch the keynote. Sometimes sometimes the time differences meant that one hub couldn't see the keynote at the same time, and so they had to wait till a few hours later. And in that case, we tried to make it possible for the speaker to speak with people after the talk had happened, even though it was a delayed talk. We also had symposia, which are groups of paper on a single theme, and these were shared by two hubs. And so one hub had an organizer and another hub had some contributors to the symposium. We used the same software, YouTube and Zoom, in order to coordinate those symposia. There are also workshops and demonstrations using similar software. Breaks are a very interesting problem because, as we were speaking about before, people want to go to conferences and talk in the corridor and meet people and have a good time over a cup of coffee. And we tried to solve this problem by having a room at every hub in which people could sit down in front of a computer and talk quasi at random to someone at another hub. And we also lined up the breaks in the program so that that was possible. If we repeat a conference of this style in the future, we're going to make appointments between senior members at one hub and junior members at another hub to make that happen more effectively. So summarizing what we think we achieved at the end of this conference, first of all, the number of participants increased quite a lot because it was easier for people in different parts of the world to participate. We also did an online survey during the conference, whether people liked the conference or not, and about 60% of people said they did, and 40% said they didn't on a rating scale. And finally, we calculated all the emissions per participant and compared them with the emissions which would have happened if everybody had flown to one location, namely Graz. And we found out that looking at that comparison, we had saved 70% of emissions. So here's a quick survey that we did. Most of the people participating in the survey were speakers, some are poster presenters. Most of the people were in Graz because the Graz hub was considerably bigger, twice as big as the second biggest hub, which was in Montreal. And this graph shows that a large number of people were basically happy with the conference. Please evaluate the semi-virtual format on the following scale. This picture is a bit misleading because we also asked for qualitative findings. People were invited to say what was good and bad about the conference, and the answer to the question what was bad about the conference generated a very large number of people who were unhappy about various things. And so actually this picture is a bit misleading, and we're currently trying to deal with all of those comments and see if we can come up with something even better. So these are the results of this survey. When we asked people what the best thing is about the conference format, they said they could watch the missed talks again. It was practical if they couldn't travel. It was environmentally friendly, and they liked the timing of the conference. And if we asked what was bad about it, they said, well, they had trouble networking, connecting to hubs. There were some problems with traveling. Of course, lack of face-to-face interaction is the most important problem that people don't like. And they had trouble dealing with the confusing timetable, which was quite complex to deal with the different time delays. And so we also asked the question, what should a future organizer do? And some people said, well, you could just fix the problems. The technology worked, but it could be even better. And other people said, well, we actually don't like this kind of conference. So I would like to thank a large number of people. I have no time to do that. There were many people organizing this conference at different hubs. Also the members of the committees that advised when we planned the conference. I'd also like to thank Park Wild, who is a colleague from Tufts, who is running a website called flyingless.org. I invite you to visit that web page and support his cause. And so now I've finished my talk. Thank you for your attention, and we're going to have a question and answer session.
Thank you, Richard. That certainly seemed like an impressive event. I would like to thank all of our speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us here today. It's certainly inspiring for me to know that there are people within the academic community who are concerned about the impact of aviation on climate change and are dedicated to helping us find alternatives. Now, Daita from AISHE will be facilitating a question and answer session. If you have any questions for any of the speakers, please enter them into the chat box on your screen, and she will organize and read them to the speakers. Daita?
Thank you so much.
We're having a little trouble hearing you.
And I think information. We also have. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. So, is it better now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Okay. So I was thanking all of you, and also was mentioning to our attendees that we have a smaller group today. So if you actually want to ask your question live, we could do a live Q&A. So any attendees that want to have a conversation with our panelists, just raise your GoToWebinar hand, and I will unmute you. But we do have a couple of questions already received, and I hope that this will spark a couple more. So first comment, you four are so terrific. What major global conferences are the most promising potential adopters of some of these innovations? And maybe let's go in the order that you presented.
Okay, so I guess that's me first. Well, what we've focused on actually, and I guess sort of the low-hanging fruit here, who would adopt this, are organizations that are already sort of environmentally, centered. So, for example, our most recent conference that we hosted at UC Santa Barbara was the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, ASLA, which is an international conference of eco-critics. These are folks who sort of a humanities-based environmental group. So I think, when I contacted ASLA, and I'm a member myself, they were receptive to the idea from the start. Other people who, have different interests and a different focus, they might be a little tougher. So, but we have a few other organizations kind of in our site now to go to next.
I will also mention, sorry, Melissa, that perhaps our audience is thinking also about AISHE, and it's a conversation that we're having every year about at least some component of live streaming or having our conference go virtual. And there may be something in the store for next year or the future years, but we're definitely not at the point where we can go all virtually.
I was just thinking about the North American conference that's happening this week, GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit in California, and events like that. The COP that happens every year, other international climate negotiations, I think it's essential that we figure out how those can be lower carbon events. I mean, being close to New York City and being from the area, the number of events outside of COP that are happening at the UN headquarters related to climate change, related to sustainability, are very, very high. And I think not only do we realistically actually need to cut those emissions, but it looks bad. It's perceived negatively, and that's important to deal with as well. We need to be models as practitioners.
Hi, can I have the question again? I missed it.
Yes, the question is, what major global conferences are the most promising potential adopters of some of these innovations?
I guess there are no major conferences. The bigger the conference, the more the emissions, and therefore we should maybe try to focus on the biggest ones in that case. But there are conferences happening everywhere all the time, and it's going up. The number of conferences is going up all the time. So someone has to make a move. Regarding my own discipline, music cognition, we have a European society, and we're already planning a conference for 2021, which will be similar to the one which we had just now. And I'm very impressed by what the other two presenters showed. I think there are many options. Any academic society can choose among these different options, and they can have meetings and they can experiment, and they can say, okay, for the next conference, we're going to try a certain format and get the benefit of that format and then evaluate it afterwards.
One thing I wanted to add was that I heard from Park Wild, the colleague at my university, that there's a lot of a lot of faculty feel pressured to go to conferences and present, but they don't necessarily really want to go to all these conferences. And so an alternative to having more conferences like this would be to think about how the tenure and promotion process works, and are there ways to give people credit without having them required to present at conferences.
That's a great point, Tina. If I could just jump in, we always hear in academia, the idea is publish or perish. Present or perish is part of that too. So in my university, when faculty come up for merit reviews and all, we tally up their presentations right alongside of their publications. They're not quite as important, but if someone doesn't present, it raises eyebrows. So we really need to think about that we are in a profession that, indirectly causes, an enormous amount of fossil fuels to be burned. And there's a not just a social pressure, a career pressure to do that. So going back to Richard's point, we need a lot of options out there to come up with other alternatives to it for people who are, and everyone should be made anxious by all that.
If I can just jump in there, I think if I'm on a committee and someone's applying for a professorship and they got 2 invitations last year and they rejected 8 invitations, I would be very impressed by that. And of course, publications are always more important than presentations. I mean, people who are going to 20 conferences a year are not publishing enough because they haven't got time. So this is a normal weighing up procedure that everyone has to do.
Thank you. The next question is from someone in information technology, which has a huge number of conferences and shows little, if any, awareness of CO2 travel footprint. What approach would you recommend to begin socializing awareness of this critical issue in this area?
Yeah, so I guess we'll go in order again, if so I'll jump right in. I think it's the strategy that, I would think this, that both Tina used and we didn't, conspire on this, and I used too, is to draw attention to, and Richard, we all did in different ways, to draw attention to just what that footprint is. And Richard's presentation, if you think about, the cost of CO2 emissions and flying somewhere compared to driving, compared to meat eating and all, especially beef, it is really significant, but it's one of those hidden things we're just not aware of. And, if you were to fly from where I am to in California to, say, Paris and back again, you could literally fly there, get on a plane, and come back again in a 24-hour period. And the cost in CO2 of jet travel is so high that in that 24-hour period, you would have completely expended your CO2 allotment for the year, for what we all should be doing if we want to hope, to meet the kind of, difficult standard set by COP21. But I mean, people just don't realize that. I mean, there's absolutely no way that you can do more to the harm to the planet in terms of climate than by getting in an airplane. You just can't do it faster any other way. Like Richard said, you have to drive around a lot in a car to do that much damage. And I think people just aren't aware of it. Yeah.
Well, my research background is in social psychology and climate psychology, and there's a lot of great resources out there if you want to look on how to communicate about sustainability issues. One that I'd recommend, if you just search for climate change communication guide, there really are great resources. That's a bit of a sneaky answer, but if you go look up those things, I think you'll find a lot. But one of the key takeaways from a lot of those resources is to make issues relevant to your audience. And sustainability, climate change, these are things that really can be related to pretty much everyone, every type of person, and the things that they're interested in, because it is such a massive issue. So with IT, I mean, I think there are great ways to talk about how technology uses a lot of energy in the ways that it does, and to actually make that real by mapping it out, using technology that actually can measure how much energy an appliance is using is a resource that we use. So forgetting what they're called, but these plug load machines that you can plug into a socket and then plug whatever it is, your computer, your light, into that, and then it'll read. You have one right there?
Kilowatt.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll give you live data. We also look a lot at how to summarize data on dashboards for our campus community so they can understand their usage. And sometimes we try to do that by department. So those are things you might be able to do in whatever IT department you're working in, and then at a conference, maybe host a session, maybe talk about this, start a discussion.
Okay, I'm on now, yes. So I was thinking one thing you could do in IT is say, well, there's a big challenge, and that is to produce software and hardware, actually, that would make it easy for people to organize conferences of this kind. And so maybe there should be some kind of competition within IT to create this software, or some kind of reward to people who produce it, right? That's one idea. And the other idea is that you need to look at the way the societies and the conferences work and find out who's actually organizing things and who's doing the work to create a conference, because any kind of conference is a lot of work. And if you can find someone who's actually going to do the next conference, you have to talk to them. And if they don't agree with you, then there's a long-term strategy of trying to get the person into that position to organize the next conference who actually agrees with your approach. So I guess the question is to work out how the interactions, the power relationships between the people work in your subdiscipline in order to make a long-term plan.
If I could just jump in here and just add a little something on. Both Richard and I also tried something else, and Melissa made me think of it, and that is we appealed to the idea to make a more equitable international conference, to open it up to all over the planet. And that's not an environmental issue, that's a social justice issue. And, you know, if when looking forward, you know, conferences have all sorts of problems, and social justice is just one of them. If we could come up with solutions that have a sort of a range of different appeals, you know, maybe someone who's not as much concerned about the environment as they are social justice issues would want to get on board for it too. So sorry, Tina.
No, I think that's a really good point, and that's one thing that I thought Ken, you did really well in the first presentation, was sort of, instead of talking about why you shouldn't do the sort of traditional conference, you highlighted why you should do this one. So what the advantage is. That's a communications, as Melissa knows, like a communications tool is to, you know, get people excited about where you want them to go, as opposed to like afraid or the other thing, there's 3 different types of resistance that people have to new ideas, and one of them is the resistance of being told what to do. And so one way that you can overcome that is by inviting these IT people to support your conferences. And so they just sort of experience it, they see how it works, and they see whether it works well or not, and then they might on their own be like, hey, why don't we do this ourselves? And I've seen that happen a little bit in our IT department, is that they start to say, like, see us hosting meetings virtually, and they're like, you know, we should do that in our department. That'd be really easy for us to do. So
thank you very much. So actually there, Richard, I can't see your slide. I'm not sure if everybody else can see his last slide with your contact information, because one of our attendees asked if there is a place to continue to network and get advice with people who are doing virtual conferences. You guys have a Twitter handle, or is there anything, you know, is there a hashtag for virtual conferences? And before I give you the chance to answer, I also wanted to mention that ASHE has an online community where you can start a thread, and you know, people can contribute to that conversation. So that's also an option for having this kind of discussion in an online forum.
Well, I do want to encourage people to look at flyingless.org, which is the professor that I talked about, Park Wild, has created this whole the online community. There's an online petition site for the general public where you can sign a petition encouraging your discipline to support Flying Less, and there's a list of academic supporters where academic is self-identified, mostly faculty and some graduate students, and there's also an FAQ page. But it might be nice for people to be able to see if there's somebody, for example, from their university that's on there, or from nearby, that they might be able to collaborate with, or even just somebody in your field. So it's flyingless.org.
All right, so let's go to the next question. We have a couple of technical questions and logistical questions. So how do you price these virtual events? And what about the access to materials after the conference, after the live events? Do you have different price tiers, or how do you even come up with the pricing?
So I'll start again. We don't charge anything, and part of the fact is the conference costs so little to run. And to go to the second part, in our approach, it creates a lasting online archive that's always up there. We don't have any password or paywall to get to it. It's there for anyone at all the time. And it goes to what's been said before, that having access to these materials, and there's a big controversy and there should be in academia now regarding the paywalls behind certain journals, which are incredibly expensive. Many universities can't afford that access. This sort of thing puts people right at the epicenter of new ideas where they're created, and anyone can get access to it. And by that I mean anyone, anywhere. There's no reason, as far as I'm concerned, to limit access, although all contributors need to know from the beginning that it is, that the archive will stay up there. Whatever they say is going to stay up there. But it's been our experience, everyone was, enthusiastic about that prospect rather than, wary of what they would say up there. Yeah. So.
I think I mentioned that we had a low cost per event, 15 to 20, depending whether it was a pre-registration or on-site. The fact that we had on-site attendees that we wanted to pay because we wanted to feed them lunch meant that we didn't want to open up the recordings to anyone online with a link. Because that price already existed, we were judging, would it be fair or not for people to have a different experience, that they could just be at home on their computers and look. And also it would have complicated the technology. So the technology and the price were actually really at play with each other for us. We were also basing the cost over the standard price for this annual event.
But I think the $15 to go to a conference, even a half-day conference, is very inexpensive. And so the thing that I loved about your presentation, Melissa, was that you were showing that you can kind of do this on a shoestring. I don't think you really got any extra support from the university for anything else. So.
Yeah, the conference we were organizing was replacing a conference series where people normally pay €300 or €400, $500 or $600 even, to go to a conference for almost a whole week or 5 or 6 days. And we had 4 hubs, of which 3 hubs were charging about the same price. It was certainly not more than the usual price of the conference. So in Graz, the maximum price was €400 and the students were paying half of that. And we had, one of our hubs was in Argentina, and the cost of participation in Argentina was much less because they have a lower gross national product, right? So we saw the benefit for people from a low income country participating with a low registration fee. We also had additional costs for technicians and for technical equipment, but we managed to keep that within the regular cost of the conference. And so that was actually something I was quite proud of. There was no increased fee because of the technical aspect.
Thank you. Yes, that's always a point of discussion for the ASHE conference, because it's also, provides income to ASHE. So if we eliminate that, then it's a little bit trickier. So pricing these virtual events is a conversation that's ongoing at ASHE. So there is also a question on what are the major costs? Do you have to pay for, you mentioned Zoom and YouTube. So YouTube is free, but you host your videos there. Zoom is a paid platform. Is there anything else that you need to pay? Do you have to hire AV companies and so on? Do you have to invest in specific technology, cameras, microphones? Do you need big storage space for the recordings, or is everything in the cloud? Or do you have backups of the talks?
I'll jump in again. So we kind of offloaded a lot of the technical requirements to individual speakers. They actually had to record their own talk, and if they wanted to record their screen and go back and forth, they had to, work that out with software. And they also had to do copy editing on their own closed captioning transcript. But the advantage of doing that meant that there was not any other requirement from our end. Insofar as they then uploaded it to YouTube themselves, YouTube is sort of, ironclad as far as, cloud storage, and I'm not worried about YouTube losing videos. The only technical thing then becomes someone who can set up the website and set up the streaming and all. But again, if you're familiar with WordPress, you could probably do that in a day. So, and that's actually WordPress, computer program is kind of a hobby of mine. Compared to a lot of other programming expertise, WordPress is pretty simple and pretty ubiquitous. So there are always plenty of graduate students around here who have that, knowledge. So it doesn't even require getting any professionals involved. So that was important for us because, again, we hope people all over the world would use this, and there's very little cost involved in doing that, or expertise really needed. But anyhow, Melissa.
Sure. Well, as Tina and I have said before, we really were working with a shoestring budget. Main costs were to buy food, since we were providing a meal for all of the students at each location, a little bit of flyers and advertising. We paid for our Facebook posts to get advertised more broadly, so there's a little cost there. Things like that, but really very minimal. I wonder if the audience members are mostly working at universities, then you may find yourself in a similar position where we have departments on campus that can offer us many of the things that we need and the locations on campus. Now, because we're a small school, and for a variety of reasons, as a staff member, I don't have to pay to rent a space on our campus. So that was definitely a nice reduction in cost. At least one of our other sites did have to pay to rent the rooms that they were going to be in for their site. But of course, we had the computers in classrooms, so all of our sessions happened in classrooms. So they were set up with modern technology. And then the college already pays for a Zoom account. So we had just worked in the previous months to make sure that I had our Zoom account for that event, since it sort of transfers among staff. They only have a certain number of licenses for campus community members at one time. But really, really low budget.
I think the other thing is some schools you have to pay for AV and some you don't. So
Right,
I think one of our sites, I think in Vermont, they hired students, like IT students, to be on site.
Mm-hmm.
I know if we'd had it at my university, we would have had to pay for AV support, especially on a weekend. So
that just wasn't an option for us.
Yeah.
Right. So you just made do.
Yeah, so our conference was a bit bigger. We had 700 people in the 4 locations. And the technology wasn't actually that expensive because, first of all, we used equipment, just like Melissa said, that was already present in the rooms. And in order to mix the PowerPoint with the talking head, you can just do it with the free software on a laptop. To send to YouTube is free. And so basically a lot of things are free or they're cheap. So for Zoom, you can pay a bit extra, like $100 or something, to get a better quality of Zoom. These are rather trivial expenses. And then on top of that, there were things like suddenly we need wireless microphones and nobody has them. And so you have to suddenly pay for that. And we would have ended up spending $1,000 per hub or something in this amount for the technology, which is very small compared to the other conference expenses like renting the rooms and the food and paying for, now this is a big one, paying for someone to do the peer review process, right? Someone has to contact all of the experts to review the submissions, right? These are big costs because paying a person 10 euros per hour, that can add up to a lot. So I'm confident in the future a conference like that can be quite cheaply done, especially in school or university classrooms.
Thank you. We are approaching the end of our webinar, but there's a couple more questions. So let me try to get to at least two more. How do you incentivize people to contribute sessions since they're more technology intensive than preparing a PowerPoint, especially for Ken's and Richard's model?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, I should note for many people, you know, making a video of yourself and putting it up online on YouTube, it's not a big thing anymore. But part of the incentive for us, though, is, you know, if you think about what you have to do for a normal conference, to fly there, to go through, you know, baggage check, to get in, to get on the airplane, to take ground transportation, and do all that. If you cut that out, even though there's a little more trouble, you know, making the video, it's a pretty big incentive, I think, and especially, you know, because now with smartphones and all, you put a smartphone, you just, you know, prop it up on a book, and you can do a great video of yourself. It's not very difficult. A lot of it comes down to how comfortable you are with the technology, but what we always recommend to someone, if you're not that comfortable with it, just ask around. Very quickly, you'll find someone who's already posting stuff up on YouTube and can handle it for you.
Okay, and my answer to that question is that, sorry, that we didn't have that problem because people just gave regular talks and they felt like they were at a regular conference.
I'll just add that even though this was a student conference and they were excited to present, it's important to note that they were not fazed by this, and it seemed very normal for these undergraduates. And some fraction of them are going to go on to do a PhD, and they'll have had this experience already. So I think it's important for young academics to get exposed to virtual conferences like this.
Thank you. Let's also try to get to this question about, Richard, you mentioned a little about virtual networking, and many attendees of in-person conferences value the time spent face-to-face with their colleagues. And you also mentioned a little bit about your, you know, your post-event surveys that provided some insights about people missing that component. Do you think we can completely remove the face-to-face events, or do you have any other insights from your attendees?
So our approach was to try to replace part of this face-to-face contact with a kind of Skyping sessions to different hubs depending on the time of day. And we had it all set up, but we found out that people were not very interested in it. And we discovered that people need quite a lot of pushing to go to that room and to participate in this event. And so we're thinking that if this happens again, and it will happen in our European society in 2021, we'll have organized events where people will actually have appointments at certain times. And it's especially interesting for senior people at one hub to talk to junior people at another hub, just to meet them and just to say, hi, how are you going? And I heard you did a paper about this and it was great and I was there, just to make personal contact by Skype. And I also think that the quality of the transmission will be increasing, and the feeling of being in personal contact like we kind of are right now will get better over the years. And so this problem will solve itself.
Yeah, if I could jump right in there, we actually did, we experimented with one conference with Skype. We call them cafes. We had 3 of them open. I was kind of interested to watch Richard's time zone presentation because we kind of built them the same way. There was one for sort of North and South America, one for Europe and Africa, another one for Asia and Australia and New Zealand. There was some interest in that, but I have to tell you that when you're communicating back and forth by writing, I mean, you can develop something of a relationship there, a different kind. But I would say that it is the #1 objection I hear from a certain group of faculty that, you know, loss of personal contact, loss of personal contact. I hear it all the time. But I can almost always be sure where that person's from. They're from North America or the EU or someplace. When I talk to people that are in other parts of the world, they immediately get on board for this because they're not getting that personal contact. They're in small regional conferences at best, and suddenly the world got opened up for them in a different way. So for them, yeah, it's a different kind of personal contact, but they're getting more than they ever thought they would get. And I think we have to kind of think about that as an issue, as yeah, maybe us in the developing world is going to be different than we're used to when we can fly everywhere and do all these things. But that's problematic for all sorts of reasons.
I had 2 comments on that. One is, I participated in a class. I was a TA for a class at Harvard where it was live streamed to all over the world. And they had a live chat that as a TA we helped like keep an eye on the chat and look for questions that people that we would ask. But it was actually really amazing how much chatting happened like while people were talking. So like that's one way, and I think they do like start developing a rapport with each other while they're like, you know, chatting. They get to know each other and everyone's thoughts, and people seem really comfortable doing that. But the other thing I think will come about in the future, and I don't know how distant, is virtual reality, and how that technology might make it a lot easier for people to interact. I don't know how this would work because I'm not a technology person, but like, you know, people might be able to feel like they're in the same room with somebody using virtual reality sometime in the future.
That's awesome. And I think we are at time. So I will just tell you a little bit about our next webinar, which will take place in a week, also on Wednesday, starting at 3 p.m. The webinar will, you will learn how to conduct a bike share feasibility study, evaluate options, select a vendor, and launch or relaunch a program on your campus. This is our next week's webinars, but we have almost a webinar on every Wednesday until the end of the year. So make sure to check out our website. And thanks so much to all of our presenters and all of our attendees. I think this was a great conversation, and it's only the start of this type of events. So I think that we'll probably continue this conversation and have more models to look at in the future. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, bye.